The fish did not care about empires. That was the first thing Neria noticed when she finally reached the lake. The water sat perfectly still in the early morning light, and whatever lived beneath its surface had no idea that a princess of the Dracavari Empire was crouching in the reeds 10 meters away, watching a human male sit in a folding chair and do absolutely nothing. She had been planning this escape for 3 weeks. It had taken 7 failed attempts before she found the drainage tunnel that ran under the eastern wall of the palace compound. It smelled terrible. She had crawled through it anyway, pushing a small pack ahead of her, her pale silver-blue scales scraping softly against the stone. The shape alteration collar around her neck hummed quietly. To anyone who glanced her way, she appeared to be a small, strange animal, the size of a large house cat, with large amber eyes and a vaguely reptilian shape that was unusual but not alarming enough to report. The human settlement was visible from her tower window every morning. She had been watching it through a stolen telescope for 4 months. 11 years, the humans had been here on Arath 4, farming the valley land below the palace moon's ridge, building their modest structures beside the lake, going about their small and apparently uncomplicated lives. The Dracavari administration had issued them a territorial notice upon arrival. After that, there had been no formal contact. Humans were a young species. There was nothing urgent to discuss. But there was one human Neria could not stop thinking about. Every morning without exception, in all weather, the old male came to the edge of the lake and sat down. He carried a long, thin rod. He attached a line to it. He dropped the end of the line into the water, and then he sat there for hours, not reading, not communicating, not doing anything that her databases could categorize as productive. She had cross-referenced the behavior against 47 research files on human culture, and the closest match was a practice called fishing, which was listed as a food-gathering technique. But the human never appeared to gather any food. He just sat. She had to know why. Now she was here, in the reeds, watching him up close for the first time, and the answer was not immediately obvious. He was old, even by human standards, with white hair and a lined face and large, weathered hands wrapped around a battered metal container from which steam rose gently into the morning air. He wore plain clothes. His equipment was simple and clearly old. He was not performing any complex calculations. He was not consulting any instruments. He was sitting in a chair looking at water. Neria edged closer. A twig snapped under her foot. The old human turned his head and looked directly at her. His eyes were calm and a pale gray color. He looked at her for a moment the way someone looks at a thing they are not sure about, but are not particularly worried by. Then he reached into a bag beside his chair and took out a small round piece of food and held it out toward her. "You look like you haven't eaten," he said. Neria had eaten a full royal breakfast 3 hours ago. It had been prepared by 12 kitchen staff and served on ceremonial plating. She approached anyway, because the gesture seemed important to respond to, and took the piece of food carefully from his fingers. It was a plain biscuit. It was warm and slightly crumbly and tasted of something simple and real. It was the best thing she had ever eaten. She sat down a short distance from his chair and looked at the water and then looked at him. "What are you doing?" she asked. The caller translated her words into the local human dialect automatically. He did not seem startled that she could speak. He glanced at her, then back at the water. "Fishing," he said. "Why?" "Because the fish are in there." She looked at the water. "I can't hear them," she said. "There is a cluster approximately 8 meters out, at a depth of around 1.5 meters. The water is slightly warmer there. They have gathered near a submerged structure of some kind. If you moved your line to that position, you would improve your probability of success significantly." The old human looked at her again, this time with more attention. "Is that right?" he said. "Yes. Your current position has no fish within effective range." He considered this. Then he picked up his rod, turned it slightly, and cast the line out toward the area she had described. The motion was smooth and practiced, the line curving through the air and settling on the water with almost no disturbance. "Better?" he said. "Much," she said. They sat in silence for a while. The lake was very quiet. A bird called from somewhere in the trees. The old human drank from his container. Neria watched the line and listened to the water and felt the tight knot in her chest that had been there for as long as she could remember loosen, very slightly, for the first time in years. "My name is Walter," the old human said eventually. Neria, she said, and then immediately thought that was unwise, and then decided it did not matter. Walter nodded once, as though they had just concluded a perfectly ordinary introduction between two people meeting beside a lake on a quiet morning, which, she supposed, they had. Do you live nearby? He asked. She looked up at the ridge where the palace compound sat against the pale sky, its towers just visible in the early light. Yes, she said. He did not ask anything else. He just watched the water. After a few minutes, he reached into his bag and handed her another biscuit without looking at her. She took it. She ate it slowly, watching the line float on the surface of the lake, and the light moved across the water, and the morning continued without any urgency at all. She did not understand yet why he came here every day, but she thought she was beginning to. She stayed until the sun was fully up, and then she slipped back into the reeds and made her way to the drainage tunnel and crawled back through the smell and the dark and came out inside the palace walls with mud on her feet and biscuit crumbs on her scales. She cleaned herself up before Yura arrived with her morning schedule. She sat through 2 ceremonial briefings and a formal study period and a dinner with 3 visiting officials who talked entirely about themselves. And the entire time, she was thinking about the lake. She went back the next morning, and the one after that. On the 4th morning, Neria brought her own chair. It was a small folding chair, taken from a storage room in the lower palace, the kind used by junior staff during outdoor ceremonies. She carried it through the drainage tunnel under one arm, scraping her elbows on the stone walls, and set it up beside Walter's chair at the edge of the lake without explanation. Walter looked at it. Then he looked at her. Then he nodded once and poured himself coffee from his thermos. On the 6th morning, she brought her own thermos. She had filled it with a hot beverage from the palace kitchens that was not coffee, but was warm and had a pleasant smell. She did not tell Walter what it was. He did not ask. They sat together in their chairs with their thermoses and their fishing rods and watched the lake, and it felt, strangely, like something that had been going on for a very long time. She asked questions every morning. She could not help it. She had been asking questions since she was old enough to form sentences, and it had been a source of friction in the palace for her entire life. Questions were not considered appropriate behavior for an imperial princess during formal study periods. Questions were to be submitted in writing to the appropriate educational officer, reviewed for suitability, and then answered in curated sessions by approved scholars who never said anything surprising. Walter just answered. She asked about the physics of the fishing rod. He explained the mechanics with the patience of someone who had once been an engineer and still thought like one, which surprised her. She asked about the history of fishing as a human practice. He gave her a rough account from memory, approximate in dates, but honest about what he did not know. She asked why different fish were found at different depths. He explained what he knew and admitted freely where his knowledge ended, which was a habit she found remarkable and could not quite account for. On the 9th morning, something happened that she had not planned for. She caught a fish. She had been holding the rod for an hour, feeling the faint movement of the water through the line, and then there was a sudden sharp pull, completely unlike anything she expected, urgent and alive. She gripped the rod hard and looked at Walter. He said, calmly, to keep the line tight and reel it in slowly. She did exactly that, her hands uncertain, the rod bending in a way that seemed alarming. And then the fish broke the surface of the water, and she saw it, silver and thrashing in the morning light, and she made a sound she had never made before in her life. She nearly fell out of the chair. Walter caught the arm of the chair before it tipped. The fish dangled at the end of the line, twisting. Neria stared at it. Walter looked at her face and then began to laugh, a quiet and genuine laugh, the kind that comes from being surprised by something good. She looked at him laughing, and then she laughed too, a short startled sound, and then stopped because she did not know what to do with the feeling, and then laughed again. She held the fish for a moment. It was cold and smooth and alive in her hands. She looked at Walter, and he nodded toward the water. She lowered the fish back in and opened her fingers and watched it dart away into the dark. You could have kept it, Walter said. I know, she said. She did not explain further. He did not push. The 10th morning brought a new development. Another human arrived. She came from the direction of the settlement, moving at a pace that suggested she was a regular visitor and not someone who needed to announce herself. She was older than Walter or close to it, with short gray hair and sharp brown eyes and a canvas bag over one shoulder. She poured herself coffee from her own thermos, sat down on a log she seemed to consider her personal property, and looked at Neria without any particular alarm. "You're not local," she said. It was not a question. Neria went very still. The shape alteration collar was functioning. To human perception, she appeared as a small, unusual animal, not clearly identifiable, not obviously threatening. But this woman was looking at her with the specific attention of someone who categorized things for a living. "I hope you're not from up the hill," the woman added, jerking her chin toward the ridge. "Because if you are, this is going to become a whole situation and I have research to finish." Neria said nothing. The woman sighed. "Fine. I'm fun. Don't chew the fishing line." Walter said, without looking up from the water, that Neria did not chew things, and that her name was Neria, and that she had excellent instincts for locating fish. Fun looked at Neria with renewed interest. "Can you echolocate?" Neria considered this for a moment and then said yes, within certain frequency ranges. Fun's expression changed completely. She put down her coffee. She picked up her data pad. She asked what the effective range was at water surface with moderate wind interference, and whether the resolution was sufficient to distinguish species by body mass, and what the upper frequency limit was before the signal degraded. Neria answered all of it. They argued for 40 minutes about deep water thermal adaptation in gill-breathing species. Neria's knowledge came from databases. Fun's came from 30 years of marine biology fieldwork. They were both right about different things. Fun said so plainly, which was another quality Neria had rarely encountered in anyone with authority or expertise. Walter fished in peace. When Neria finally climbed back through the drainage tunnel that evening, she was still thinking about something Fun had said near the end of their argument. They had been discussing the way certain fish species altered their behavior in response to environmental stress, adapting without losing their core biology. Fun had said, offhandedly, that the ones who adapted fastest were rarely the strongest or the biggest. They were the ones who paid closest attention. Neria turned that over in her mind all the way through the evening meal and the study period and the long formal silence of the palace night. Back at the lake, she knew, Walter was sitting in his chair or walking home slowly in the dark, and the fish were going wherever fish went when no one was watching, and the water was doing nothing but being water, patient and unhurried and indifferent to rank. She thought she was starting to understand something. She was not yet sure what to call it. She set her alarm for before dawn, the same as every day. She would figure it out tomorrow. There was a small pale scale on the stone floor of the drainage tunnel. Greth almost missed it. He had been walking the perimeter of the eastern wall at dawn, checking the exterior motion sensors for the third time, running out of places to look and reasons to stay calm. The scale was near the tunnel grate, half hidden under a fine layer of dust, catching the light at a particular angle that made it visible for only a moment before the sun shifted. He crouched down and picked it up between two fingers. It was pale silver blue. Imperial coloring. It was the size of his thumbnail. He sat down on the ground. He did not panic. Greth had been head of palace security for 11 years, and before that he had served in 3 military campaigns, and before that he had grown up in a border province where things went wrong regularly, and the ability to not panic was a survival skill rather than a professional one. He sat on the cold stone and held the scale and breathed carefully for approximately 30 seconds. Then he stood up and opened the tunnel grate and looked inside. It was large enough for a small person. It smelled very bad. At the far end, faint light was visible. He did not go through it. He went around. He came out on the other side of the eastern wall and stood at the edge of the ridge that dropped into the valley below. The human settlement was visible from here, the buildings small and plain in the early light, smoke rising from a few of them. The lake caught the dawn and held it flat and bright at the far edge of the fields. He scanned the area with his field scope. It took him 4 minutes to find her. She was sitting in a chair, a small folding chair placed beside a larger one. There was an old human male in the larger chair. They appeared to be talking. Between them there was a thermos and what he could only describe as a fishing rod, which his scope's identification software confirmed was exactly that. A third human, a woman, arrived while he watched and sat on a log nearby. The woman appeared to be arguing about something. The princess appeared to be arguing back. She looked, he thought, more comfortable than he had ever seen her in the palace. He lowered the scope. This was a situation with many possible responses, and he needed to choose the correct one without making anything worse. He could go down there directly. He could send a retrieval unit. He could report immediately to the senior administrative staff, which would escalate it to the Imperial household, which would escalate it to the Emperor, which would result in consequences he did not want to think about yet. Or he could watch for one more day, confirm she was safe, and plan his next move carefully. He chose to watch. He also noted, with the precise honesty that had kept him alive and employed for a long time, that he chose it partly because watching was the responsible option and partly because he did not know what would happen if he walked down there and ended whatever was happening by the lake, and he was not ready to find out. He filed a private report. He marked it internal. He went back to the palace and told the senior staff that the sensor malfunction in the eastern corridor was being addressed and that the princess had been located and was currently safe and in the process of being returned to supervised quarters. This was a simplification. He told himself it was not a lie. The days continued. Greth came to the ridge each morning. He watched through the scope. He watched the princess learn to cast a line, badly at first, and then with improving precision. He watched her in animated conversation with the older woman, both of them gesturing at a data pad. He watched the old man, Walter, as his reports had identified him, move around the lake with the unhurried steadiness of someone who had been doing this for decades and had no intention of changing anything about it. He watched the morning the princess caught a fish. He saw her nearly fall out of the chair. He saw her laugh, and then he put the scope down for a moment because it felt like he was watching something private. On the 13th day, something changed. A junior palace official named Reth, who was ambitious and attentive and had noticed the security team running extra perimeter checks, submitted a formal inquiry to the administrative registry about the princess's schedule irregularities. This was within Reth's authority. It triggered an automatic review. The review escalated. By midday, the senior household administrator had been notified. By evening, the matter had been elevated to the Imperial household. Greth received a summons 2 hours before the palace lights dimmed for night cycle. He stood before the senior household administrator, a thin and formal Drakavari named Oren, who had been in service to the Imperial family for longer than Greth had been alive and who expressed displeasure with such absolute stillness that it was more alarming than shouting. A retrieval order has been issued, Oren said. 72 hours. Understood, Greth said. The matter is not to be discussed outside this office. Understood. The princess is not to be harmed. Greth looked at him. She was never going to be harmed. Oren was quiet for a moment. No, he said, with something that might have been tiredness underneath the formality. I suppose she wasn't. He set down his documents and looked at Greth directly. How does she seem? Greth thought about the chair by the lake, the thermos, the fish she had caught and released, the laugh he had looked away from. Well, he said, she seems well. Oren nodded once. He picked up his documents again. Greth walked back through the palace corridors in the direction of his quarters and stopped once in a long empty hallway and stood there for a moment with his hand against the cold wall. He had 72 hours. He was going to use 60 of them to do nothing, which was not something he had ever done intentionally before and which felt, unexpectedly, like the first wise thing he had done in this entire situation. In the morning, he would go to the ridge again. He would watch the lake. He would give the princess one more day that was entirely her own, because whatever was happening down there beside the water was doing something to her that the palace had not managed in 16 years of trying. He did not know what to call it either, but he recognized it. He had felt it once, a long time ago, in a place far from here, before duty became the whole of everything. He had almost forgotten that it was a thing that could be felt. He walked the rest of the way to his quarters and sat at his desk in the dark and did not file any reports until morning. Walter was not fishing when Neria arrived. He was sitting in his chair the way he always did, with his rod resting across his knees, but his hands were still in his lap and his eyes were on the water without really seeing it. He did not turn when she came through the reeds. He did not greet her. The thermos sat unopened beside him. She sat down in her chair and looked at him. Something about his stillness this morning was different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was full and easy, the way a lake is still when nothing is wrong with it. This stillness was the other kind. What is wrong? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My wife used to fish with me. Before she died. He paused. Today is the anniversary of that. Neria did not know what to say. Among the Drakavari, death and grief were formal things. There were official mourning periods, registered with the household office. There were designated grief companions, trained and certified for the purpose. There were prescribed behaviors and approved expressions and a clear timeline with a defined endpoint. You did not discuss grief beside a lake with someone you barely knew. It was not done. She said nothing. She looked at the water. After a while, Walter picked up the thermos and poured 2 cups, which he sometimes did when fun was there. He set one beside Neria's chair without comment. She picked it up. It was warm. She liked mornings, he said eventually. Not to Neria particularly. More to the lake. She said the light was different in the morning. Softer. He looked at the water. She was right about that. Neria looked at the morning light on the water. It was softer. She had noticed this on her second day and had attributed it to the angle of the sun relative to the atmosphere. Both things could be true. I am sorry about your wife, she said. Walter nodded. Thank you. They fished in silence for a long time. Fun did not come today, either because Walter had told her not to or because she knew somehow, in the way that old friends know things. The lake was very quiet. Neria paid attention to the silence and found that it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that had something in it. After the better part of an hour, Walter said, She would have liked you. She didn't mind questions. Most people mind questions, Neria said. Most people don't have good answers, he said. Makes them defensive. Neria turned that over. She had been told most of her life that her questions were disruptive, that they broke the flow of instruction, that they showed a lack of respect for established knowledge. No one had ever suggested that the problem was with the people who couldn't answer them. Walter, she said. What do you think of the Drakavari? He looked at her sideways. It was a careful look, not unfriendly. The palace up the hill. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I think they have very impressive architecture, he said. I think they've been here 11 years and never once came down to say hello, which is either very rude or very shy, and I can't tell which. He looked back at the water. My wife would have gone up and knocked on the door inside the first week. They would have hated that. They would have, Nereus said. It would have violated approximately 9 formal protocols. Walter glanced at her again. Is that right? She realized what she had said. She did not take it back. Walter looked at her for a long moment. His pale gray eyes were calm and thoughtful and not, she noticed, particularly surprised. He said, The Drakavari consider humans a young species, not ready for serious contact. Yes, she said. Who told them that? They decided it themselves. Based on what? She opened her mouth to answer and found that the answer she had was the same answer she had been given without question her entire life, and that she had never once questioned it until this moment, sitting beside a lake in the mud, and the answer was, because they are old and we are new, and old is the same as wise, and new is the same as unfinished. She closed her mouth. Walter nodded slowly. Sounds like something someone says, he said, when they're afraid of being wrong about something important. The words landed quietly. He had not said them to wound her. He had said them the way he said most things, plainly and without decoration, the way you say something you have simply noticed and see no reason to hide. She sat with it. The next morning, she came to the lake and found Greth already there. He was standing at the edge of the reeds, in plain clothes and not his security uniform, which she understood immediately was a choice he had made. He was looking at Walter, who was looking at him, and Walter had a cup of coffee extended in Greth's direction with the same unhurried calm with which he had offered Neria a biscuit on the first morning. Greth was holding the coffee. He looked exhausted. He turned when he heard her come through the reeds. The expression on his face was not anger. It was something more complicated, a mix of relief and sorrow and the particular tiredness of a person who has been responsible for something precious for a very long time and has just had a difficult week. Princess, he said. Greth, she said. A retrieval order has been issued, he said. I have delayed it as long as I could. She looked at Walter. Walter was watching the exchange with his usual expression, which was the expression of a man watching something unfold that he had partly expected and was simply waiting to understand fully. He was still holding his fishing rod. Did you know? She asked him. I figured something was unusual about day 3, he said, when you correctly identified 6 fish species by echolocation. But I was pretty sure around day 6 when you stopped flinching at the tunnel smell. Whatever you were crawling through to get here, it wasn't a garden path. She stared at him. Does it change anything? He said. Who you are? She thought about it. The lake sat quietly in front of her. The light was soft. She could hear fish moving below the surface, unhurried and indifferent to everything above the waterline. No, she said. Didn't think so. He nodded at the rack of rods leaning against his chair. You've got time for one more fish before you go. She picked up a rod. She baited the hook the way he had taught her, with the particular knot that kept the bait secure in a small current. She cast the line, not perfectly but close. It settled on the water without much disturbance. Greth stood at the edge of the reeds and drank his coffee and did not speak. Walter poured himself a cup and sat down and did not speak either. The three of them watched the line float on the surface of the lake in the soft morning light, and the only sounds were the water and the birds and the small noises of the world going about its business without asking anyone's permission. She caught a fish 20 minutes before she had to leave. It was the best one yet. She held it for a moment. Its scales caught the light. She lowered it back into the water and watched it disappear, and did not say anything, and did not need to. Walter walked her to the edge of the settlement. He shook Greth's hand, which seemed to slightly alarm Greth, and which Greth then allowed with the careful dignity of a man accepting something he does not fully understand but recognizes as sincere. Walter went back to his chair. He did not watch them go. Neria walked up the ridge toward the palace with Greth 2 steps behind her, and the lake at her back, and a thought forming that was not yet words, something about old and new and finished, and still going. And she kept hold of it carefully all the way up through the palace gates, because she was going to need it. The throne room of the palace compound on Arath 4 was not the largest throne room in the Dracavari Empire. It was a colonial facility, a seat of regional administration rather than the great imperial halls on the homeworld. But it had been built to the same specifications, with the same proportions, the same stone, and the same light, and the same particular quality of silence that was not natural silence, but manufactured silence, designed to remind anyone who stood in it that they were very small and the institution they stood before was very old. Neria had stood in this room many times. She had always been aware of the silence and what it was for. She was aware of it now. Emperor Dravos stood at the far end of the room, not seated on the formal throne but standing beside it, which was a choice. He was very tall, even for their species, with deep charcoal scales and eyes the color of old amber, and he had the particular stillness of someone who had not needed to raise his voice in a very long time. Several senior household officials stood at the sides of the room. Oren was among them, his face carefully neutral. Greth stood near the door, having been dismissed from the formal proceedings, but not having gone very far. The emperor looked at his daughter for a long time. You went to the human settlement, he said. Yes, she said. 14 times. 15, she said. Counting this morning. The silence expanded. You were seen, he said. By the humans. Directly. Yes. You spoke with them. At length. He clasped his hands behind his back, which was a gesture she had known since childhood, and which meant that he was working very hard at being controlled. And what, he said, in the tone of someone asking a question they already regret, could you possibly have gained from this? She had been thinking about this for the entire walk up the ridge and through the palace gates and down the long corridor and into this room. She had thought about it in the measured way she thought about things that mattered, turning it over and looking at each side. She said, I learned that a species you have described as primitive has been sitting beside a lake for 11 years without complaining that no one came to say hello. I learned that one of them, a man named Walter who is 72 years old and has no idea who I am, explained grief to me in a way no ceremonial grief guide in this palace ever has. I learned that his neighbor can argue xenobiology in a way that was more useful and honest than any approved educational session I have attended since I was 6 years old. And I learned that all 3 of us can sit beside water for an hour without saying a word, and it is not uncomfortable. It is the least uncomfortable I have felt in this palace or anywhere near it in as long as I can remember. The throne room was very still. They are a young species, the emperor said. The words were measured. They were a position being restated rather than a belief being expressed, and she could hear the difference. They are a species, she said, that has been at war with itself throughout its entire history and has nonetheless continued to get up every morning and try again. They do not describe themselves as finished. They do not have a word for arrived. Walter told me that humans have made terrible mistakes and learned from some of them, and failed to learn from others, and then made the same mistakes again. And he said it the way you say something true that you are not ashamed of. He did not make it sound like weakness. He made it sound like the thing you do when you are still alive and still paying attention. She paused. She looked at her father, who was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read, which was unusual. She had been reading his expressions since she could see. The Drakavari, she said, have spent 3,000 years telling ourselves that we are the finished product of what civilization can be. We say it in the histories. We say it in the ceremony texts. We say it every time we dismiss a new species as not ready for serious contact. And I want to ask you, because I have thought about this very carefully, and I do not think the question is disrespectful, I want to ask you what we are so afraid of finding out. The room was absolutely still. Because that is what Walter said to me, she said. Not in those words. He would not use those words, because he is not an unkind person. But he said that describing someone as not ready sounds like something a person says when they are afraid of being wrong about something important. And I sat beside that lake for 15 mornings thinking about what we would be wrong about. And I think I know. I think we would be wrong about what finished means. I think we would find out that old is not the same as wise, and that 3,000 years of not making mistakes is not the same as knowing how to recover from them. Silence. Emperor Dravos had not moved. His expression had not changed in any way that could be formally named. But something in the room was different, and she could feel it. He said, very quietly, "That is a great deal to learn from sitting beside a lake." "Yes," she said. "Walter is an excellent teacher." The emperor was still for another long moment. Then he said, "You will return to your quarters. This matter will be reviewed." She had expected punishment. She had expected a formal reprimand at minimum and a restriction of privileges that would make the previous ones look generous. She stood still and waited for it. It did not come. He turned away from her, which was dismissal, and he stood looking at the wall for a moment before he spoke again without turning. "The fish," he said. "You released them." She blinked. "Yes." "Everyone." "Yes." He was quiet. "Why?" She thought about the fish she had released that morning, the light on its scales, the moment of holding something alive and choosing what to do with it. She thought about what she had said to Walter and what Walter had said in return. Because they deserved another chance, she said. He said nothing else. She left. In the corridor outside, Greth was leaning against the wall. He straightened when she came out and fell into step beside her. Neither of them spoke until they were around the corner, and the throne room was well behind them. Then Greth said, quietly and without looking at her, "That was well done." She did not say anything. She was thinking about her father's face in the moment before he turned away, and the things she had seen in it that she had not expected. He had looked, for just a moment, like someone who had heard something true and was deciding what to do with it. Not a king, not an emperor, just an old being who was very tired of a position he had held for a very long time, standing in a room full of silence he had built himself, trying to remember whether he had always known it was manufactured or whether he had started to believe it somewhere along the way. She thought of Walter sitting by the lake in the early morning, in his plain chair with his battered thermos, and the way the light came off the water soft and without ceremony, and the way he had never once seemed like he needed anyone to tell him that he was in the right place. She hoped her father would think about it. She thought he might. 6 months after a Drakavari princess crawled through a drainage tunnel and accepted a biscuit from a retired engineer, Governor Aldrich of the Arath 4 human settlement received an official communication from the palace compound. He read it 3 times. Then he called Fun. Fun arrived. Aldrich said he did not know. Fun said he should find out. Then she went home and began organizing her notes, which had filled 2 data pads in the past 6 months, and which she had been writing on the reasonable assumption that sooner or later this day would come, because the universe tended to move in the direction of conversations that needed to happen, and this one had needed to happen for 11 years. The contact delegation arrived on a clear morning, formal and precise. 7 Drakavari representatives in ceremonial attire, accompanied by an administrative staff of 4, made their way down the ridge path to the edge of the settlement, where Aldrich and 3 of his senior people were waiting. The Drakavari were larger than most humans expected from the official photographs, and their bearing was careful and still in the way of people who had been trained since birth to give nothing away. The greeting was formal on both sides. There were words and acknowledgments and the particular awkwardness of 2 parties who have never done this before and are both determined not to be the one who does it wrong. Aldrich shook hands. The Drakavari did not shake hands, but accepted the gesture with good grace. One of them asked what shaking hands was supposed to communicate. Aldrich explained. The Drakavari representative considered this and said it was an efficient way to establish physical non-threat. Aldrich said he had never thought of it that way, but supposed that was right. No one noticed the small figure in the plain cloak who slipped around the edge of the group and walked away from the settlement, toward the lake. Walter was there. He was always there. He was sitting in his chair with his rod and his thermos, watching the water with his usual unhurried attention. He did not turn right away. He had always had good hearing, and he knew the sound of Neria moving through the reeds, which was different from any other sound in the vicinity. When she came out of the reeds, he turned and looked at her and nodded once, the same nod he had given her on the first morning, as though no particular amount of time had passed. Her chair was under the dock. He had kept it there. She pulled it out and set it up beside his and sat down. He handed her a rod. She checked the line out of habit and found it was rigged correctly, which meant he had set it up that morning already prepared, which meant he had expected her. She did not ask about this. She baited the hook and cast the line. It settled on the water cleanly. They sat. "How are you?" he said. "Complicated," she said. He nodded. "Good complicated or bad complicated?" She thought about it. 6 months of palace confinement and internal reviews and formal hearings, and one long and careful conversation with her father that had ended not in resolution, but in something smaller and more honest, a kind of mutual acknowledgement that neither of them had all the answers, and that this was, perhaps, a place to start. She thought about the retrieval order that had quietly been replaced by a supervised contact provision, which allowed her, under certain conditions, to be in the vicinity of the human settlement. She thought about Greth, who had submitted the paperwork for the supervised contact provision himself without being asked. "Good complicated," she said. He nodded again. He drank his coffee. The lake was doing what lakes do, which is to say it was being patient. Behind them, at the edge of the settlement, things were happening. Finn had found the Drakavari atmospheric scientist within the first 20 minutes of the delegation's arrival, which had not required much effort on her part because he had found her first, having read her published work on aquatic thermal adaptation and recognized her name. They were now sitting on a bench outside the settlement's main building with 2 data pads between them and the expressions of people who have just discovered that a conversation they assumed was impossible is not only possible, but overdue and extremely interesting. Aldrich was giving the senior delegation member a tour of the settlement. The tour was modest. The settlement was modest. Aldrich knew this and had decided early on that he was not going to apologize for it. When the delegation member commented, with careful neutrality, that the structures were simple in design, Aldrich said yes. They had built them fast and with materials they had on hand, because that was what you did when you were starting somewhere new. He said they had plans for better ones and were working on them. He said the fields were producing 30% more than projected this season, which had surprised everyone, and he had a report if the delegation was interested. The delegation member looked at him for a moment, then said yes. He was interested. 2 junior delegation members had drifted toward the lake. They stood at a respectful distance, watching Walter and the small figure beside him. One of them asked the other, quietly, what they were doing. The other said fishing. The first one said what was that? The other said he did not know but had filed it in his notes under human rituals requiring follow-up. One of them eventually walked closer and stood at the edge of the reeds. Walter noticed them. He did not wave them off. He said, without turning, that there was room and that they were welcome to come and watch, and that it was quieter if they came without the formal posture because fish could tell when something nearby was tense. The 2 delegation members exchanged a look. Then they came forward and stood at the water's edge and watched the lines float on the surface. After a few minutes, one of them asked what they were waiting for. Walter began to explain. He explained it the way he always explained it, plainly and without hurry, talking about the water and the fish and the patience of it, and the particular quality of morning light, and why that mattered, and why the whole point was not really the fish at all. And the two delegation members stood and listened and did not interrupt, and by the end of it one of them said that he thought he understood, and the other one said he wanted to try. Walter handed over a rod. By mid-morning, there were 6 Drakavari delegation members sitting or standing at various points along the lakeshore, holding borrowed rods or watching those who held them, in various states of confusion and interest. None of them had caught anything. Several of them were beginning to understand that this was acceptable. Greth had appeared from somewhere and was standing off to one side, not fishing, but watching everything with the calm attention of a man who has decided that his job today is simply to be present and see what happens. Fun arrived at the lake with the atmospheric scientist in tow. She poured herself coffee. The atmospheric scientist accepted a cup from Walter, looked at it, and drank it. He made a face. He asked for more. Neria and Walter fished. At one point Neria said, without preamble, "My father asked me yesterday what fishing felt like." Walter was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it felt like permission," she said. "To not be anywhere else." Walter considered this. "That's a better description than any I've come up with," he said. The morning passed the way mornings at the lake always passed, which was slowly and well. Near midday, Neria's line moved. She set the hook cleanly, the way Walter had taught her, and reeled in slowly, and the fish came up out of the water, the best one she had ever caught. Several of the delegation members turned to look. Greth straightened slightly. Finn pointed it out to the atmospheric scientist. Neria held the fish for a moment. It caught the light. She could feel its weight and the life in it, its particular urgency to be back in the water where it belonged. She looked at it for a long moment, long enough to see it clearly and remember it. Then she lowered it to the surface and opened her hands. Walter watched the fish disappear into the dark water. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You know, you're going to have to actually keep one eventually." "Eventually," she said. He smiled. It was the unhurried smile of a man who was not in any particular rush. He poured himself the last of the coffee and settled back in his chair and looked at the lake, where the line sat floating in the soft light, and the water did what it always did, moving without urgency toward wherever water goes, indifferent to empires and titles, and the long complicated business of civilizations trying to figure out how to speak to each other. Far up the ridge, the palace towers caught the midday sun. Far down the shore, Finn was arguing. In between, 6 beings from one of the oldest spacefaring civilizations in the known galaxy sat beside a lake on a small moon, holding borrowed fishing rods, learning with some difficulty how to wait without a reason. Nobody caught anything. It was, by every measure that mattered, a very good morning.